Welcome to our lecture on basic botany. The background to this slide includes flowers from this week's Family of the Week in a Wisconsin prairie on a sunny September day. Do you know what the plant family is? If not, you'll find out very soon. This week we'll explore some basic botanical concepts you'll use throughout the semester, which could also provide a foundation for your future botanical studies, and which I hope help you to better notice the plants around you. The reading for this week was the first chapter of a botany textbook, and in some cases went into more detail than will be relevant for us in this course. Here I will highlight and expand on the parts that are most relevant to this course. The other parts of the chapter do provide important context as to the role of plants in the history of the earth, as well as some details about their subcellular structures, which we may touch on here and there throughout the course. So please consider these parts of the chapter as reference to explore as needed or as desired. For the lecture, I'll start by defining what a plant is, then we'll take a look at the evolutionary tree of life, including where plants fit in major plant lineages. After that, we'll look at basic plant structures and their functions, focusing specifically on those of flowering plants, or angiosperms, and then I'll introduce the family of the week. Take a moment to think about what you believe makes a plant a plant. What do most plants have in common that defines them as a group? Different authorities have different ways to define what a plant is, and that is in part because it gets a little sticky around the edges in terms of distinguishing plants from other closely related organisms. I'm actually going to provide a definition from another textbook here, which is slightly different from that listed in your book, but the characteristics it includes are more relevant to how we see and notice plants. In general, plants are composed of many cells, as opposed to some unicellular fungi and algae, both of which are groups closely related to plants. Plants have cellulose-rich cell walls. Cellulose is a polysaccharide made up of many glucose molecules, and its structure makes it very difficult to break down. For example, humans cannot digest cellulose, so it serves as dietary fiber, which is one reason that plant foods play such an important role in our nutrition and gut health. Cellulose is also important for many ethnobotanically significant products, like cotton and paper. Here is a picture of a cotton fruit. It contains fibers, or hairs, attached to seeds. These fibers are composed of about 90% cellulose. Here on the right you can see a close-up of the fibers. You may have included in your plant definition that plants are green, and that is an important defining characteristic of most plants. They are green because they have chloroplasts, which perform photosynthesis. As a reminder, photosynthesis is when plants use the energy from sunlight to convert carbon dioxide and water to produce glucose and oxygen. So they capture the energy in light and convert it to chemical energy stored as sugar. And this is the ultimate source of energy for most life on Earth. The energy in our food, for example, all initially came from chloroplasts converting sunlight to sugar, even if we're not only eating plants. I remember once when I was teaching about photosynthesis to young children, and one looked at me with wide open eyes and said, "So when I eat this carrot, it's kind of like I'm eating the sun?" Yep. For me, the exceptions to the rule are just as exciting. And over the course of evolution, some plants have lost the ability to photosynthesize, and therefore are not green at all. In fact, there are over 4,000 plant species that derive their food from other organisms. Here is an example. Monotropa uniflora, or commonly called ghost pipe, is saprophytic, meaning it derives its nutrition from dead matter, like decomposing leaves. You might notice these flowering in the woods right now if you look closely. And the final characteristic is that plants are adapted to life on land. Of course, there are exceptions to this rule as well. But like the exceptions to the photosynthesis rule, aquatic plants descended from land plants. Or, in other words, they lost the ability to live on land and developed adaptations to live in the water. One example shown here are water lilies. The giant water lilies in this photo are pretty incredible, with leaves reaching up to 3 meters in diameter. Another way to define plants is by their evolutionary relationships to other organisms. Evolutionary trees, like the one here, display evolutionary relationships among organisms. Groups of organisms that are alive today are listed on the tips of the branches, and the branching patterns that lead to them tell us something about how these groups evolved and relate to one another. We will look much more closely at this next week when we explore plant classification. But for now, know that groups whose branches connect more immediately are more closely related to one another than groups with lots of branching leading out to them. So for example, angiosperms and gymnosperms, which connect here, are more closely related to one another than angiosperms and mosses, which connect down here. On this tree, we see 3 major groups of organisms: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Within eukarya are 3 groups commonly studied by botanists: plants, algae, though these are actually a few separate groups, and fungi. Algae include not only the slime you may see in a dirty pool, but also macroalgae like seaweed. And fungi include molds, mushrooms, yeasts, and the like. Our focus will be just on the true plants, right here. If we zoom in just on the plant lineage, we see the relationships among the major groups of plants. These are the bryophytes, lycophytes, pteridophytes, gymnosperms, and angiosperms. We'll take a peek at each of these here, but this semester, much of our focus will be on the angiosperms. The bryophytes were the first group of land plants to evolve. One example of these are the mosses. Bryophytes live in moist environments because they do not have seeds, which are an important adaptation to keeping embryos of new plants from drying out. They are also distinct in that they do not have true leaves with veins, stems, or roots. Instead of roots, structures called rhizoids anchor them to rocks, bark, or soil. Shown here is peat moss. With its excellent capacity to store water, it's used in garden soil mixes and has also been used in diapering babies by multiple indigenous groups. The next diverging lineage are the lycophytes. These plants do have true, simple leaves with only one unbranched vein, but they also lack seeds and are often also found in moist environments. Selaginella, one example, is shown here. You can see the very small single-veined leaves. Next, we look at the pteridophytes, which are ferns and fern allies. Some members of this group now do have more complex leaves with branching veins, but they still do not produce seeds. Have you ever turned over a fern leaf and seen something like this? These are spores encased in sporangia, and clustered in bundles called sori. So if you ever see a leaf and are not sure if it's a fern, you might try flipping it over. And if it is a fern, and you caught it at a point of its life when it's producing spores, you might see something like this. Another way to distinguish a fern from other plants is that ferns do not have aerial stems. Instead, their leaves appear to come up straight from the ground, as you see here. Now come the two groups of seed plants. These are what you might think of when you think of a prototypical plant. But as you've seen, they're not the only ones. The evolution of seeds allows seed plants to live entirely on dry land, where they are often rooted in the soil. The first of these are the gymnosperms. We can learn a lot about gymnosperms just by their name. Gymno comes from the Greek word for naked, as does gymnasium, and sperm means seed. So the defining characteristic of gymnosperms are naked seeds, or seeds without fruits. Relatedly, since fruits come from flowers, gymnosperms also lack flowers. Gymnosperms include the commonly known conifer trees, like pines and spruces, as well as a few other groups, like ginkgos and cycads. Have you ever had pine nuts? Well, these are actually seeds, not nuts, and are produced naked in the bracts of ovule-bearing pine cones, as shown here. This is after pollination by pollen from pollen-bearing pine cones, which are generally much smaller and located on a different part of the tree. Keep an eye open for these in the spring. This plant pictured here includes pinyon pine seeds, which is a food native to the southwestern United States. Angiosperms are the other plant group with seeds. Again, the name is informative, since angio comes from the Greek word meaning case, and sperm is seed. So angiosperm seeds are encased in fruits. This is related to their characteristic of producing flowers. Angiosperms are the most diverse group of land plants and are responsible for a large majority of our foods, medicines, and other plant-derived products, so they will be our focus this semester. Pictured here is one of my favorite garden flowers and the delicious fruit that develops from it, okra. We'll now move into a tour of the major organs of angiosperms. This figure, figure 1.5 from your reading, is an important one and one you'll likely come back to time and again. We'll first look at the roots, then the shoot system, including stems and leaves, followed by reproductive structures, including flowers, fruits, and seeds. For each of these, we'll take a look at some examples as they relate to food. One important note is that for everything I tell you here, there will be exceptions, since over evolutionary time, many plant organs have been modified, making them more fit for survival in different circumstances. Even so, I do believe it's helpful to start by learning the general rules which apply to many plants and which provide a context from which we can better understand deviations from those rules down the line. We'll start off with roots. Roots are generally made of a dominant central taproot with lateral roots branching off. Root hairs grow near the growing tip of the roots, and they absorb water and minerals from the soil. Since sometimes there are roots that grow above ground, and sometimes there are stems that grow underground, a good way to distinguish roots from stems is that roots do not produce buds or leaves. Rather than branching out through buds, they do so through below-surface groups of cells called root primordia. Roots have two major functions: to absorb water and minerals from the soil and to anchor plants in the ground. An important modification of some roots is the ability to store sugars during the winter. They then send the sugars back up to the shoot system so the plant can continue growing in the spring. Humans have taken advantage of this characteristic and have bred some important root vegetable crops, like the one shown here. Now, as I show you ethnobotanically important examples of each plant structure, remember that they come from a plant that has all the structures. I often hear from people that two different foods must be related because, for example, they're both roots. No, this does not make them related, and root is not a characteristic of those food plants. It is the part of those food plants that we find useful. Take a look at this entire carrot plant with leaves and flowers and fruits with seeds to see what I'm talking about here. Now we'll move on to the shoot system, starting with the stems. The shoot system is generally made up of cylindrical parts, like trunks or branches. They contain a protective layer, like epidermis or bark, and, unlike roots, stems branch out through buds. One thing to note is that while buds can open to form new stems, they can also open into flowers or leaves. The main function of stems are their role in supporting the plant, as well as their ability to transport water through xylem and sugar through phloem. The truth is, as far as foods go, we really don't eat many stems. The main stem we eat is potato, which is a modified stem called a tuber. Have you ever let a potato go too long without eating it and seen buds develop? This is our hint that potatoes are stems and not roots. Sugarcane is another ethnobotanically important stem, and the part of the plant from which table sugar is derived. Next, we'll look at leaves, the second part of the shoot system. As you all know, leaves are generally flat, green, and borne along stems at nodes, though there are a ton of fun exceptions to this rule, some of which are mentioned in your reading. The basic architecture of a leaf is that it is comprised of a petiole and blade. The blade is probably what many of you thought of as the leaf, and the petiole is like the blade's personal stem, but it is developmentally leaf and not stem tissue. And the main function of leaves is photosynthesis. Many leaves' shape, size, and orientation is directly related to maximizing their photosynthetic capacity. Here is a very simple leaf diagram. You can see the petiole and the blade, and that it originates from the stem at the node. We can usually tell a leaf is a leaf because it is subtended by an axillary bud. Axillary means armpit or shoulder, so think of this bud as being in the armpit of the leaf. Some leaves have a single simple blade, and some are what we call compound, meaning that their blades are made of multiple distinct leaflets branching from the petiole. But we can tell a leaflet from a leaf because leaflets are not subtended by an axillary bud. These buds only show up in the armpits of the entire leaves, as you can see here. Some of you gardeners out there may have learned how to harvest basil in a way that encourages bushing out, but you may not know that this technique is based on axillary buds. If you pinch off your basil right above a part of the stem where a pair of leaves come out, then this sends out a hormone called auxin, which tells the axillary buds to develop into new branches on your basil plant. We eat tons of leaves, including both blade and petiole, and sometimes we eat just petioles as well, like celery stalks. Here you can see how celery stalks are not stems, but rather leaf petioles. Here are the blades, and here is the small, modified stem from which the leaves emerge. For those of you interested in plant identification, how leaves are arranged along a stem is often an important characteristic for identifying a plant. Leaf arrangement is generally divided into 3 types. When there is 1 leaf per node, this is called alternate leaf arrangement. When there are 2 leaves per node, this is opposite. And when there are 3 or more leaves per node, this is called whorled. This may come in handy if you use a key to identify the plant you've selected for your observations. And keep in mind, you can see leaf arrangement patterns even when a deciduous plant has lost its leaves by observing the arrangement of buds or leaf scars. Now we'll look at the reproductive structures, many of which have been driven to their extraordinary forms due to coevolution with pollinators and seed dispersers. First is the flower. This is the basic structure of a perfect flower. In other words, one that contains all parts. You can see that the flower is made up of whorls. I'm going to go through and highlight the main components of each whorl and the ones I'd like you to know. Starting from the outermost whorl are the sepals, which are collectively referred to as the calyx. Sepals are often leaf-like structures at the base of the flower. Then come the petals, collectively called the corolla. Followed by this are the pollen-bearing reproductive organs, the stamens, made up of filaments and anthers. Filaments are stalks that hold up the anthers, which are the sites of pollen production. Pollen contains sperm, so stamens are commonly considered quote-unquote male plant organs. Then is the pistil, which includes the stigma, style, and ovary, which contains ovules. Pistils, then, are commonly considered quote-unquote female plant organs. Pistils are made up of units called carpels. A flower can have 1 pistil with 1 carpel, 1 pistil made up of multiple fused carpels, or multiple pistils with 1 carpel each. We'll come back to this when we talk about fruits. The main function of flowers, of course, is sexual reproduction. When pollen lands on a stigma, sperm travels down the style and ends up in the ovary, where it fertilizes the egg cell in the ovule. The result, which we'll see in a moment, is fruit with seeds. The ovary becoming the fruit, and the ovules becoming seeds. There are many, many, many modifications to this basic form, impacting, among other things, the structure of resulting fruits. Which brings us to fruits. Fruits are the casing around seeds. They come in many, many different forms. Not all are what we think of as fleshy fruits. Let's take a moment to appreciate the gigantic diversity of forms fruits can exhibit. Fruit diversity is amazing. I've included a great poster from UW-Madison that displays this. Take a closer look here, or Google UW-Madison Classification of Fruits poster to explore fruit diversity and how botanists make sense of it. Though we'll touch on these concepts as we learn about fruits throughout the course, the level of detail on this poster is more for your interest than something we'll look closely at. One main distinction I would like you to know is that a simple fruit is one that comes from a single flower with a single pistil and ovary. When the pistil is made of a single carpel, you get fruits with one chamber, like peaches. When the pistil is made of multiple carpels, you get fruits with multiple chambers, like oranges and tomatoes. An aggregate fruit is one that comes from a single flower with multiple pistils and ovaries, like raspberries. And a multiple fruit is many fruits from many flowers and ovaries that fuse together to function as one, like a pineapple. And of course, the function of fruits is to protect and disperse seeds. Many are dispersed by animals, but also by wind, air, and water. And our last angiosperm structure are the seeds. A seed contains not only the embryo, or new baby plant, but also stored food for that plant and a seed coat to protect it. Here you can see the seed coat, the endosperm, which is the stored food, and the embryo, which consists of the regions that will grow into the shoot and root systems, and the cotyledons, or first leaves. The function of the seed is to provide energy and protection to the developing embryo, and of course, become a new plant. Seeds can be great sources of energy and protein in our diet, and they take many forms. Some seeds or parts of seeds that we eat include coconuts, dried beans, and almonds. There are also many, many more. Now we've made it to the family of the week, which is the family of those prairie flowers on the first slide. It's the Asteraceae, or sunflower family. I chose this family of the week because there are so many Asteraceae plants blooming right now, and also because, now that you know something about plant structure, you'll now look at many of these flowers much differently. The Asteraceae is made up of many familiar plants, including sunflower, daisy, zinnia, dandelion, thistle, marigold, lettuce, artichoke, burdock, and chamomile. The list goes on and on. The defining feature of the Asteraceae is their composite flowers. When we see what looks like a single flower, what we see that looks like a single flower is not actually one flower, but rather a head made up of many small flowers. The flowers along the edge that look like petals are called ray flowers, and they are bilaterally symmetrical. And the flowers in the center are called disc flowers, and they look more like our standard flower because they are radially symmetrical. Sunflower seeds, then, come from one-seeded fruits that each develop from single disc flowers. Some Asteraceae flowers don't have both ray and disc flowers as sunflowers do. Some have only ray flowers, like dandelions, and some have only disc flowers, like the thistle below. I encourage you to go out and find some typical Asteraceae flowers that are blooming now and look closely. Can you see why these are actually heads comprised of many tiny flowers? And with that, we conclude our lecture on basic botany. Thanks for listening.